Welcome to Trending Tidbits. Are you ready for this? We're diving into a question that's, it's pretty mind-blowing. Is China actually, taking a page out of the Hundred Years' War playbook for their global strategy?
Wow, now that's a historical comparison you don't hear every day.
I know, right? It's wild. Our source material today is the Wikipedia article on the Hundred Years' War. And let me tell you, it is a wild ride. We're talking over a century, a whole century of back and forth between England and France, sometimes all-out war, sometimes, kind of a break.
Right?
Shifting alliances all over the place, economic warfare. It's
Right.
crazy. And then you see these new military technologies popping up that completely change the game.
Yeah, like game changers. At the end of the day, the Hundred Years' War was about control,
Yeah.
power, influence.
Exactly. And that makes you wonder, right? Are we seeing echoes of that in what China is doing in the world today?
It's a fascinating question. I mean, history doesn't repeat itself exactly.
Right, of course not.
But there are some interesting, let's say, potential similarities. Might make you think twice about how China's operated.
Okay, no crystal ball here, but lay it on me. What kind of parallels are we talking about?
Let's start with economics. One of the biggest things about the Hundred Years' War is that England had control of the English Channel. Huge advantage.
Sure.
I mean, think about it. They could totally disrupt trade, mess with France's economy,
Yeah.
exert their influence all over this vital waterway.
Okay, so I'm seeing where you're going with this.
Yeah.
But how does that, translate to China? You think they're trying to control trade routes, too, like a modern-day English channel?
Not exactly the same, no, but think about it. China is like the manufacturing hub of the world, right? And then there's their Belt and Road Initiative.
Okay.
That's strategic investment in infrastructure, controlling supply chains. It's all kind of, connected.
So they're positioning themselves to put the squeeze on economically.
Yeah, they could exert some serious pressure on their rivals if they wanted to.
That's a pretty big comparison. But here's the thing. Is China really in it for the long haul? We're talking about 100 years, right? Generations.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Who knows what's going on in the minds of Chinese strategists?
Right.
But we can look at their history. China hasn't had a war that lasted a full century, but they've had some really, really long ones,
Oh, yeah.
like the Three Kingdoms period. Over 60 years of intense rivalry and warfare.
Wow.
That kind of experience, that historical understanding, it shapes how they think.
So you're saying they get attrition warfare, wearing down the opponent over
Oh,
time.
they understand it.
Yeah.
And that's what makes their current rivalry with the U.S. so interesting. If they're willing to play the long game, to engage in this strategic competition for years, decades even, it changes everything.
Okay, that's fascinating. But hold on. If we're talking about the 100 Years' War, doesn't that mean, tanks and troops and massive battles? That doesn't seem very likely these days, does it?
You're right. A war like that, on that scale, not so appealing in the, in the nuclear age.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The tools of power, of influence, they've evolved.
Okay, I'm listening. What kind of new weapons are we talking about?
Think cyber warfare, economic pressure, sanctions, diplomacy. These are the tools you use to weaken your rivals without going to war.
So it's a different kind of fight, but no less intense.
Right. And maybe even more unnerving because it's harder to, pin down, to defend against.
It's insidious.
Yeah.
But are you really saying that China is consciously copying a conflict from centuries ago?
I mean, who can say for sure? But the parallels are definitely there. They're worth thinking about.
Let's see. So we've got economics, this shift from direct military conflict to more subtle pressure. What other echoes of the 100 Years' War are we seeing in China's actions?
Well, the Hundred Years' War wasn't just two sides, England and France, going at it.
Right?
There were factions from all over Western Europe.
What is-
Oh, yeah, Flanders, Scotland, Castile. Even the Pope got involved.
Wow.
It was this tangled web of alliances, rivalries, everyone trying to, get the upper hand.
So it's even more complicated than we thought.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what's so interesting to think about in relation to China today. Think about their actions in Africa.
Okay.
Their support for certain regimes, their involvement in those territorial disputes in the South China Sea.
Right.
It's almost like a modern-day version of what we saw back then.
So China's making alliances, building relationships, trying to spread their influence?
Exactly. It's strategic. They're playing this global game of chess, moving their pieces around the board.
I like that analogy. Okay, so we've got the alliances. What else?
Well, speaking of moving pieces,
Mm-hmm.
there's another big aspect of the Hundred Years' War we need to talk about: technology.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
And China's definitely making big moves when it comes to technology.
Yep. Big moves. And this is where we see another echo of the Hundred Years' War. Military technology was like the deciding factor in that whole conflict.
In what way?
Well, take the English longbow, for example. Total game changer in the early battles, gave them a huge advantage.
Right.
And then you have the rise of cannons, revolutionized siege warfare.
Yeah, I can see how that would change things.
It shifted the balance of power completely.
So are you saying that's what China is doing today? Investing in all this advanced technology to, gain an advantage, just like they did back then?
It's something to think about, isn't it? I mean, look at their investments in hypersonic missiles, AI, space technology. This stuff is changing the game.
It's like they're looking back at the Hundred Years' War and saying, okay, longbow, cannon. What's our version of that?
Right. And if this whole 100 years playbook theory has any merit, the big question is, how do other countries respond? Are we ready for this kind of, strategic competition?
It's a little intimidating, honestly.
It is. I mean, the world today is way more complex than it was back then. But maybe, just maybe, by looking at the dynamics of that conflict, we can learn something, some insights that can help us navigate the challenges we face today.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
What kind of insights are we talking about?
Well, one of the biggest takeaways from the Hundred Years' War is how important alliances are. Both England and France, they relied heavily on their allies to fight their wars.
Makes sense.
And those alliances, they were constantly shifting, making and breaking depending on the situation.
So in this, 100 years playbook scenario, countries need to be really careful about who they team up with.
Absolutely. And they need to be ready for those alliances to change. Remember Burgundy in the Hundred Years' War?
No, remind me.
They were allied with England at first, but then, boom, they switched sides to France. Totally changed the game.
Wow. So you're saying we could see some major shakeups in the alliances of today's world?
It's definitely possible, especially with China becoming more, assertive. You could see countries rethinking their partnerships.
Yeah.
Maybe even traditional alliances getting strained, maybe even breaking, and new ones forming.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. In this global landscape, everything's changing. You've got to be flexible, strategic. And that brings us to another big lesson from the 100 Years' War: adaptation.
Oh, interesting. So we can't just sit back and assume everything's going to stay the same.
No way. You got to be ready to adapt. New circumstances, new challenges. You got to roll with it.
What does that look like, practically speaking?
Think about it. The 100 Years' War, it was a time of constant innovation. Military technology, strategy. It was all evolving rapidly.
Okay.
The English had the longbow, but then the French caught up, surpassed them with their artillery and, their military organization.
So you snooze, you lose.
Basically, if you wanted to survive, let alone win, you had to adapt.
Right.
And that's true today, too. If a country wants to stay competitive on the world stage, they can't fall behind.
In any area, right?
Yeah.
Technology, economics, diplomacy.
All of it. And this is where it gets really exciting. Because this need to adapt, to innovate, it's not just about the military anymore. It's everything. Economic policy, technology, diplomacy, even cultural influence.
It's like this high-stakes game of chess where the rules are constantly changing.
Exactly. And you got to keep up or you're going to get checkmated. The 100 Years' War, it shows us that resilience is key.
Okay, so alliances, adaptation. What other lessons can we learn from this period of history? What else can help us deal with this whole 100 years playbook situation?
Well, think about how long the 100 Years' War was. Over a century. Both France and England, they went through some really tough times. Military defeats, economic struggles, internal divisions.
Yeah, it was brutal.
But they kept going. They persevered. And that's another important lesson: resilience.
So buckle up, because this could be a long ride and a bumpy one.
Yeah, there will be setbacks, challenges, but you got to be able to bounce back, to learn from your mistakes, adapt your strategies, and keep moving forward. And that's true for, individuals just as much as nations.
It's like life advice from the 100 Years' War.
Right. But it's true. So if we're going to apply this historical lens, what's the main takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they try to, understand this crazy world?
The most important thing is to see the historical parallels, but not get too hung up on them.
Okay.
The 100 Years' War, it can teach us a lot, but it's not a crystal ball. We can't predict the future. But by studying the past, we can understand the present better. and be more prepared for what's coming.
So study the past, adapt to the present, and be ready for anything.
Exactly. And that brings us to the practical side of all this. How do we actually take this historical analysis and, do something with it? Welcome back to Trending Tidbits. We've been on this crazy journey trying to figure out if China is like pulling 100 years war on the world stage. It's a pretty intense comparison, to be honest.
It is. We've seen some really striking parallels, like their economic strategy, those proxy conflicts, the race for technology.
Yeah, and then there's the whole question of what this 100 years playbook means for everyone else.
Yeah.
Alliances, adaptation, resilience. Sounds kind of ominous, right?
It's definitely a challenging landscape. But we've been focusing on the potential downsides. Maybe there are some opportunities here too.
Oh, like a silver lining to this whole thing.
Maybe. History isn't always doom and gloom, right? The Hundred Years' War, yeah, it was a mess. But there were also some incredible advances: art, culture, governance.
So even with all this competition, there's still room for progress.
Absolutely. Necessity is the mother of invention, right? When countries are pushing to stay ahead, you might see a burst of creativity, innovation in all kinds of fields.
Okay, so instead of just worrying about the bad stuff, we should be looking for those like unexpected breakthroughs.
Exactly. Think about it. Renewable energy, space exploration, artificial intelligence. This competition could push us to achieve amazing things.
It's like maybe it's not about winning or losing, but about how we play the game.
I like that.
Yeah.
And that brings us to something really important, maybe the most important thing of all: communication, diplomacy.
Oh, okay.
You look back at the Hundred Years' War, and it's clear it was a failure of diplomacy that led to all that, all that conflict, all that suffering.
So how do we avoid making the same mistake? If this 100 years playbook is real, how do we, stop history from repeating itself?
We have to keep talking to each other, even when we disagree, even when things are tense.
Right.
We have to try to understand each other's cultures, perspectives, goals, find common ground, build bridges, not walls.
More talking, less fighting makes sense to me.
Exactly. And that's not weakness. That's wisdom. That's strength. That's how we navigate this complex world, how we build a future where, cooperation wins out.
Wow, you've given us a lot to think about today. It's like a crash course in global strategy with a side of history.
Well, that's what history is good for. It can shed light on the present and inspire us to build a better future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that's our deep dive into China and the 100 Years' War. Thanks for joining us on this historical adventure.
It's been a pleasure.
And remember, everyone, history might rhyme, but it doesn't repeat. So stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. See you next time.